Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark, and today we are talking about the big lie. The big lie is why approximately 30% of the country believes that the election was rigged. It is Donald Trump saying that the 2020 election was not free and fair and that the outcomes were rigged by Democrats. Over the last couple of weeks, we've asked two different focus groups about the big lie. We have a group of Trump 2020 voters and then a group of voters that we call on this podcast flippers, people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and did not vote for him in 2020. My guest today is Ben Ginsberg. So Ben was a fixture on the legal teams of George W. Bush and Mitt Romney during their presidential campaigns. He even worked for Bush during the 2000 Florida recount. But in the 2020 election, Ben found himself speaking out against efforts to undermine confidence in our elections. And lately, his research at Stanford has focused on health and credibility of voting in elections. Ben, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Okay, so you and I just were together on this New York Times sort of roundtable on the health of democracy. Ostensibly, we were the conservatives at the table, but we were both, we were kind of pessimistic about the state of the Republican Party. It actually, if you haven't read it, it's a good conversation. It's the cover of New York Times Magazine. But how did watching these focus groups make you feel?
The focus groups I thought were really interesting. I mean, I am mostly interested in what the big lie, the Trump reaction to the 2020 elections means for the future institution of voting and the democracy itself, because voting is such an integral part of that. And what your focus groups pointed out was how entrenched the election deniers are in their beliefs, which kind of reinforces the point that that is not sustainable in a democracy. You can't have 30% of the country not believing in elections. And so where we're really lacking is how we talk to that 30%. There is a dialogue that really has to take place about the election system and how reliable it in fact is. And that's an important conversation that we're trying to figure out how to have, but haven't really succeeded yet.
Yeah, I would love to jump into that as we go through these conversations. Like, as you listen to these voters, because the Trump voters, 100% of them say the election was stolen, certainly in this group. But I guess I would say one of the things that's interesting to me is how consistent this group is. You know, you and I have been having this conversation prior to you actually getting to watch some of the focus groups. I've been saying to you, hey, let me tell you how 2020 Trump voters sound. And I was texting you in the middle of it, kind of like, this is what I'm talking about. Were you surprised by how entrenched they were or what you were hearing?
Well, I wasn't necessarily surprised because you had warned me. And in fact, I've been having conversations like that and know how deep the feelings run amongst Trump voters. What continues to jump out at me from those conversations is that when you ask for the proof of it, it gets real vague real quick. In other words, election denial tends to be about a 2-sentence conversation, and then nobody quite knows what to say after that because the views are so entrenched and the backup isn't there. And see, part of it is that my guess is that we sound the same way to them.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, well, let's start with some of the ways that we hear people talk about why they think that the election was stolen.
They went to Trump rallies that were filling stadiums, and then Biden can't even fill a freaking library. Like, no, it's not true. I don't believe it. Don't buy it.
Watching and seeing how many people would show up to a Trump rally versus how many people would show up for any of the Democratic rallies. To me, there was a clear movement and then a lack of movement within the two parties.
There was 10 million more votes for Trump in this last election than he got in 2016. You're telling me that Biden got that many?
So this is a popular one, right? the rallies, the number of votes that Trump got, that is evidence that the election was stolen. And Biden had COVID as an excuse for why he wasn't holding big events. But I think if we're being honest, it's doubtful Biden could have filled a stadium the way that Trump does. So you can sort of see how people who love Trump are kind of flabbergasted by Biden winning. They kind of do the same thing with yard signs. They're like, but everybody around me has a Trump yard sign. How does this bozo Biden beat Trump when there's so many yard signs? To me, though, it's more of a testament to how polarized we are socially and geographically. People just can't believe the other guy won because they themselves don't know anyone who voted for him. It was sort of similar in liberal circles when Trump won. They were like, but I don't know anyone who voted for Trump. What do you make of this?
Yeah, you're really right. There's a great book by a University of Texas demographer named Bill Bishop that was written 15 years ago, and it's called The Big Sort. And it talked about the then 35-year-long trend in the U.S. for us to be living in more homogeneous communities, to be living more with people like ourselves. That's only grown stronger in the last 15 years. So that doesn't have to do with politics. It has to do with much deeper social forces. But it is certainly true that we spend much more time generally with people like ourselves. So you don't hear the other side. I mean, as for the rallies, I find that fascinating. I go back to the 2004 election, and 3 weeks before the election, Bruce Springsteen had a huge rally for John Kerry in the Ohio State Stadium. And they filled that stadium. And we all thought, oh man, that's it. We're going to lose Ohio in 2004. And of course, that didn't happen. George Bush won Ohio by 115,000 votes. And that just told me, don't pay attention to rallies as real indications, because they may be 100,000 people, but there are going to be 2.5 million or 3 million people voting in Ohio. And rallies make a candidate and his supporters who are in the stadium feel like there's no way they can lose with that much of a crowd. But yet, election after election after election, it's not who has the larger rallies who necessarily wins. It's not an indicator of successful elections.
Well, tough to sell that to some of these Trump voters, especially the ones who had attended the rallies. But let's hear the other number one reason we hear from voters, which is the Trump was winning when I went to bed, and when I woke up, Biden was winning. Let's hear some of those.
Looking at some of the states that were so last to come in with the results and then all of a sudden flip to a Democratic state, I think that some of that is just very far-fetched and hard to believe.
I mean, when I went to bed, Trump was so in the lead, and then I get up and he's not in the lead. I mean, that's crazy.
I saw this infographic a couple of days ago and I saved it. So I just pulled it up. It's between 3:30 and 4:30 a.m. They found 140,000 mail-in ballots for Biden in Wisconsin. Between 3:30 and 5 a.m., they found 200,000 mail-in ballots for Biden in Michigan. Between 2 and 4 a.m., they found 1 million mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania. All for Biden, none for Trump. Nothing to see here.
Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, we just stopped counting the votes. That was it for the day. And you wake up the next morning, and like you said, there was all these votes for Biden, and it took, I think it was upwards of a week for them to actually figure out for sure that he won. It was just unheard of in a presidential election not to know, other than maybe Bush in 2000.
All right, Ben, I want to go deep on this point because I got to tell you, I just hear this over and over and over again in focus groups. And to your earlier point about how the evidence is a little thin, but this is what people say. I went to bed, Trump was winning. I woke up, Biden winning. Therefore, fraud. And you hear one of the gentlemen is talking about an infographic. Just somebody put a meme up and he's reading this meme as though they found 140,000 votes. They found these votes. If you go back and try to remember the 2020 election, the media tried to prepare people for this. The mainstream media was talking about a red mirage, how it was likely that the in-person voting the day of was going to be in favor of Trump. But as they counted mail-in ballots, that those were going to skew more Biden. They tried to tell people, right, the pandemic was happening. And so the election was going to look different. And there were a bunch of states that refused, despite attempts to do so, to open the ballots and start counting them early. And so as a result, They were counting throughout the night and at some point had to take a break and start counting again. But this is the nub of where people think the fraud was, right? But like, how do you convince somebody who just believes they found the votes, not that they were counting the votes, but that they found them, that what they believe is wrong?
Well, I think there's a long-term answer to that, which is to let people understand the way the election system actually works and the way you count ballots. But I think the reason for this phenomenon was what you mentioned before, which is how polarized we are and how the red team is listening to one set of media outlets that was not talking about the blue wave and the red mirage, and then the mainstream media that was talking about it. So the reason you have this split in the country, I think, is that we're on different islands on media outlets where we're really getting our election information. I mean, it was totally predictable that Trump would be ahead on election night because those were the election day votes that were being tallied, and that Biden would pull ahead in states where they weren't starting to tabulate absentee votes until the polls closed. Now, one of the crazy things about this is that those states where Trump was ahead and Biden was behind had, I think, really sort of self-destructive rules that prohibited their election officials from counting absentee ballots until the polls closed. There were more sensible states that recognized that in 2020, especially in a pandemic year, there would be lots of absentee ballots. So they should be not counting the ballots, but opening them up, preparing them, and then putting them through the machines with all the other ballots on election night. So there are questions of election administration processes that really kind of determined which states counted late after election day and which didn't.
Can I ask you about this? Because I've long wondered. Pennsylvania was one of these states that refused to start counting, and that's my home state. You know, Donald Trump, I think sometimes people don't remember how much spade work he was doing before the election to lay the predicate that the election was going to be stolen if it didn't go his way. And it always seemed weird to me that places like Pennsylvania didn't open the ballots. So, like, they almost wanted to have a situation like the one we saw so that they could help sow doubt. Am I being conspiratorialist here? Like, why didn't they just say, yes, obviously we need to start opening these early. We're going to have a deluge of mail-in and absentee ballots.
Well, first of all, Pennsylvania Republicans really messed up by not letting the ballots be opened before Election Day. But I think that it was deeper and maybe even a greater problem. Remember that there were lots of suits, especially in Pennsylvania, that sort of sought to throw out all sorts of categories of absentee ballots. And so I think that there was an element of fear that if they started counting before Election Day, that would lessen the possibility of them prevailing on those suits. But it was really, I thought, misplayed by Republicans who should want the ballots at least processed, not counted, but processed, so they could be rung up with the election night tallies instead of weeks later.
Yeah.
And by the way, Sarah, Democrats screwed this up too, because they kept trying to extend the deadlines for the receipt of absentee ballots till after Election Day. They thought they would get a political advantage of it. This was not some great, heartfelt, moral principle. They thought they'd get more votes from ballots that were cast by Election Day but came in later. But that's a huge mistake because that does cast doubt on the veracity of the elections to have ballots coming in afterwards.
You were talking about something, though, that I think is really important to this story about the big lie, which is, you know, when people say, okay, so I went to bed at night and Trump's up, wake up, Biden's up. One of the things that whole narrative misses is that Fox News called Arizona before midnight that night. Let's listen to some footage from that night.
But what is this happening here? Why is Arizona blue? Did we just call it? Did we make a call in Arizona? Well, let's see. Now, there's a check mark. Did our decision desk make it? Arizona, 11 electoral votes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, if that's the case, then, guys, when we come back, we'll fill this in.
Okay, time out. This is a big development.
Yeah.
The Fox News decision desk is calling Arizona for Joe Biden. That is a big get for the Biden campaign.
Okay, so this is a pivotal moment, not just for the election and who was going to win, but a big moment for Fox News. Okay, so Fox calling it for Arizona was the biggest indicator that Biden was going to win. And there was the element of it being Fox News that gave people confidence, like gave people like us confidence, because if Fox is calling it, it must be true. But that moment actually had huge implications for cementing the big lie and for Fox News. Fox viewers felt betrayed by the Arizona call. Trump actually tried to lean on Fox to get it reversed. They stood firm at the time, but then as they saw an exodus of viewers going to Newsmax and OANN, they started to change their tune. In fact, they even fired their political editor, Chris Steyerwalt, who made the call that night. And after that, they sort of began flirting with the big lie more and more in order to not be outflanked by these rivals willing to go sort of the full election trutherism. So listen to how some of these MAGA voters talk about Fox News now.
If I want to listen to the trash side, I'll go to Fox News and stuff like that.
The only person I like on there is Tucker.
I mean, they called Arizona for Biden with 20% of the vote count.
This kind of talk has become a staple of the MAGA focus group since the 2020 election. And it can't be overstated how much media consumption correlates with belief in the big lie, in my opinion. So, Ben, what do you think? I mean, to me, the big story here is that Fox News, by calling it for Biden, that was seen as a betrayal, and people stopped trusting Fox News. And so they went to these other news stations that were like all in on the election lies, and they became a much bigger deal because people wanted to be fed that. Just how do you see the media's role in all this?
Well, I think the media role is a really tough definition these days because I think that the media itself is so splintered. But one of the other things that your focus group showed is that it's not only cable TV that's the leading edge. I mean, on any given night, Fox has maybe 3 or 4 million listeners or viewers. And in fact, you know, Trump got 147 million votes. So there's a big delta there. And what your focus group participants certainly said was that they're getting their news, and we got to put kind of air quotes around news for all of us, but there were an awful lot of social media sites, Parler, Telegram, a meme that they saw on a social media feed. I mean, in other words, where people get information these days is so all over the map that there is bound to be bad information going. So Fox is the leading indicator. I mean, it's kind of the flagship of MAGA media, but it certainly is not the only source of it, which means if you're trying to correct misinformation or the big lie, it's really tough because there are so many different vehicles where people on both the left and the right get their information these days.
Yeah, but this is kind of my point. Like, what was striking to me about the Fox News situation was in the early days, they didn't want to lie and they wanted to stand by their decision desk call. But the problem is that the voters would not abide, right? Their viewers would not abide being told the truth. And so they went to seek out a more comforting narrative about the election being stolen from all of these other news sources. And that created a competition or a pressure on Fox to try to hold on to people. And I would say, look, Fox has been in the tank for Trump the whole time, but I think you saw an even bigger lurch into sort of the conspiracy theories out of a market competition with all of these people that were outflanking them on the election trutherism.
So what I really want to understand from you in all this, on this theory, is how you get from the 3 to 4 million viewers that Fox has to the massive influence and credibility that election denial has. And so while Fox is instructive for the behavior that they had to show to keep their place in the market, it ain't that big a market.
That is my point, though. My point is that there's all this other stuff. Like, people say Fox as though Fox is the culprit. And I'm saying Fox is actually responding to the market pressure of there being a proliferation of other far-right media things. And I'm including like YouTubers and Telegram and TikToks and all this stuff. Like, people say Fox, but actually, I'm not sure even people who aren't on the right realize how deep the constellation of far right, quote unquote, media stuff. Like Steve Bannon's podcast is like a top 3 or 4 national podcast. It's 4 hours long and it puts out this election denialism stuff constantly. I will say, though, to your point about the delta, the gap between the people who are deeply embedded in this versus the casual person who's like, yeah, I think something was wrong with this and I don't understand, you can hear that breakdown in these groups. You can hear the guy who's like, let me read you this meme that I found with numbers and facts, none of which are true. But let me read this to you, versus the people who are like, just doesn't feel right. Went to sleep and everything changed. And I don't like that. I always talk about how, because we are so sorted, people swim in a sort of toxic soup of Trumpism and misinformation, where the smartest guy at their job, the one that they get their political intel from, he watches Tucker and Hannity every night. They don't. But when they talk about politics, that's the guy being like, well, I saw this on Tucker the other night. Let me tell you about this crazy thing. And those people are just then part of their extended network on Facebook and everything else. And that's how they become convinced, is my theory.
Yeah, or it may be that there are alternative sources of media that we're not really seeing. I mean, I think that talk radio, I've had a convincing case made to me by some guy on the internet that talk radio is really the driving force of a lot of opinion, far more than cable TV these days. So I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know how the social media sites come in, but I think it points up the problem that if you do want to push back on the big lie, it's tough to know the proper vehicles for doing that, because it's a splinter market on the right, just like it is on the left. And so driving a national narrative anywhere is really tough these days.
Oh, central point. The bifurcation and total diaspora of media is making it very difficult when people are like, well, how do we reach people? How do you create these narratives? It is like the central question around information right now. But I want to just go a little bit more into the depth of the MAGA's belief that it had to be stolen with the kind of it just had to be. The number one thing they focus on really is this mail-in ballots. Like Donald Trump did an effective job at convincing people that the mail-in ballots were nefarious. But you also hear them point to a general sense that things just didn't add up somehow, even if they can't really point to any hard evidence. Listen to how some voters talk about that.
Seeing mail-in ballots, that was a crock. People, they come up with names. There was like dead people. That's, no, he did not win. Biden did not win this election.
I can't really put my finger on it, but something just doesn't feel right.
Watching what happened on election night, and then just like everybody else said, when everything just kind of stopped, and then all of a sudden things picked back up, and it was miraculous how everything just all of a sudden, slowly but surely, just moved all the way over into the Biden territory. It just didn't smell right.
I think what convinced me more that the election was fixed was how vehemently they have said it wasn't, how they've gone after everybody and anybody who dared to say or infer that it might have been fixed or there might have been some shady goings on, and that they're still trying to continue to smear Trump. They're so afraid that he might run again and win. All of those sort of things convinced me that they didn't get there honestly, and that they're worried still that they might be found out.
So that last person's evidence that the election was stolen is that people like us keep telling them that the election was not, in fact, stolen. And why would we be so vociferous in that if there wasn't some shady thing going on? But here's my question. Like, you've spent your career in the legal trenches of Republican politics. And so for our listeners who, I assume, haven't, is it even possible to commit the kind of fraud that these people think was committed? Like, have you ever seen fraud on a scale that would cause you alarm about the way our elections are run?
No, I think, look, I spent 38 years doing election day operations for Republican Party committees and candidates. So I have watched polls and done sort of roving squads encompassing many precincts on election day. I've done the nationwide boiler rooms. And we're always vigilant. We always tried to find that. The truth was we never did. And you have to be honest about the evidence, which is why I took exception to what Donald Trump was saying. But it points up a fact that there needs to be a lot of educating about the election system and the safeguards in it. The truth is, you could not possibly commit fraud in the way that they're saying on a nationwide basis or even on a statewide basis. It would require an unbelievable number of people keeping a secret, which goodness knows we never do in this country about anything, let alone about stealing an election. So no, this couldn't have happened. But if there's one way to deal with the 2022 and 2024 elections, it is being sure that the people who run elections explain all the safeguards in the system so that there is at least more evidence in the record about why you could never have a fraudulent election in the way Donald Trump says. So I think that should certainly be one of the priorities. As for the mail-in thoughts, to me, Donald Trump going on about mail-in voting could have actually cost him the election. Truth is, Republicans in many states like mail-in voting. It is part of the basic minimum winning coalition get out the vote plans for Republicans in many states. Look at the numbers for the T in Pennsylvania and the way it fell off in the 2020 pandemic year. And it is one area where Donald Trump might have made up enough votes, but didn't. In Arizona, where the Republican electorate is, goodness knows, aging gracefully, but aging, absentee voting is something that people have relished for 25 years. In Wisconsin, it's cold in the winter, and Republicans are an elderly voting bloc. They like absentee voting. It is a self-defeating prophecy for Republicans to be trashing mail-in voting.
Yeah, that's a great point. Back after the election happened, you did have people like Chris Krebs, who ran Trump's cybersecurity thing, saying it was one of the most secure elections of our lifetime. You even had Bill Barr, right? Trump loyalist Bill Barr, who came out and said there was no widespread voter fraud. And I guess back then I kind of thought, okay, well, this has to have some impact if people like Bill Barr are pushing back. But instead, this is how people feel about it.
I think he's saying what he has to say that so he can make sure he's going to get the next job that he applies for. He's not going to be one of those people that's going to be canceled and stuck not being able to get a position somewhere. So I think he's just kind of trying to stay more in the middle so that he's not one of these people that are targeted and never gets another government position.
One way of paying off people like him is with book deals. So they get these really lucrative book deals that they never would have gotten otherwise if they say the right things. And sure enough, Bill Barr's got a big book deal.
It's sort of like you're either with Trump or you can have a job.
So, Ben, when people are kind of constructing their own reality, right, they think that Bill Barr is only saying that the election was not stolen because he's after a book deal or, because he wants a post-Trump job. They just don't believe it. Moving forward, how are we going to convince people that the election was on the up and up?
That is a great question. So, number one, I think it is important to look to the future, but it is also important to correct the past. So, Bill Barr in his book and Chris Krebs are two examples. I think there's a need for sort of a definitive look at all the charges that Trump and his supporters made in lawsuits that were filed and how the courts dismissed them. And to make that point again and again with a lot of conservatives, people who do want to see conservative public policy enacted, who are not Democrats, saying that Trump never made his case, that there was a lot of rhetoric, they never made the case. Here are the things that they raised. Here's why those things are incorrect. And I think it's important to get that on the record and then combine that with education about basic systems of election administration and why they work.
I think this piece about trust in the election system and how we rebuild it, because the reality does exist that because Trump has actively undermined it, we do have a confidence problem. And so we asked voters what they think we should do to restore faith in our election system. And here's what they said.
I think what the states need to do is they need to be more open and forefront in terms of what their process is and how they go about validating and verifying that somebody who's supposedly voting is actually registered and where they're registered for.
I think we need to take Dominion completely out of the equation. There's no reason why we need that complex of a computer system to simply count ballots. There's, third world countries that have much simpler, elections where, like, was it the Iraqis that after they voted, they put their thumb in the ink, that way they couldn't vote twice. There was much less fraud in that election compared to a first world country like ours in 2020.
Having to vote in person, if you're not just being lazy and not going to vote, you can't just vote at home if you're just not wanting to go vote. There's got to be a reason why you can't come vote.
Having time frames that have to be set, so all the votes have to be placed and count by a certain time, and none of this 3 a.m. We're going home for the night. Everything has to be done by a certain time.
I don't know, Ben. Do you think that we should be more like third world countries in how we count our votes? Obviously, some of these solutions are things that are built in or that Republicans actively rejected in the 2020 election. But, we've seen a rash of bills from Republicans that are built on this idea of election integrity and restoring faith. They all fail to mention that the reason that people's faith has been shaken is because Donald Trump has actively undermined it. But what do you make about some of these bills that have come from all kinds of Republican legislatures saying that they want to make elections more secure?
Oh, I think they are wrongly getting bunched up in one big pile. And I think there are different types of laws that are being proposed. It makes sense to me to have a series of laws in a state that go to the appearance of credibility in the election results. And I think that there are nuggets of that in the state laws. What I mean about the sort of everything's getting lumped up in one big pile is that a lot of the crying from the left is things like reducing 2 days of early voting in Georgia, which would give Georgia 24 days of early voting, and it's a reduction. So people yell and scream. However, you do have to remember that Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, all blue states, and Joe Biden's Delaware only allow 10 days of early voting. So that I think things like early voting and drop boxes and mail-in voting is more political tactics than great constitutional challenges. So I put those in one bucket. And some states, Georgia, Texas, Florida, have some provisions that can actually sort of negate the popular vote. And I think those election subversion laws are really dangerous. And that's like criminalizing the activities of elections officials. I think is really, really dangerous. There are ones that give state legislatures instead of election administrators the ability to sort of refine the final certification of the vote, just taking things away from professionals and giving it to politicians, which I think is a bad, bad development. And some states have created additional leeway for partisan poll watchers to do things in a polling place, which I think can cause the disruption of voting in ways that can be harmful. And I think those are really dangerous. So I think there actually are laws that can be passed that increase the credibility. And the debate over all the election laws, I think, has got distorted in a little bit of hyperbolic rhetoric that overall doesn't help much.
You mean you don't think that the Georgia law was Jim Crow 2.0?
Well, I think that there were some parts of it that were real, real bad, but I think it generally got a bad rap for the wrong reasons. In other words, reducing the number of days for early voting, I think, was a tactical fight between the parties. But when Georgia says we're going to weaponize poll watchers to give them more power, while at the same time saying, well, you can't give water to people standing in line because they may be too politicized by somebody giving them a bottle of water. I think that's real wrong and real bad. And I think kicking Brad Raffensperger as the Secretary of State off the state elections board is bad.
Yeah.
But I think there was no nuance in the overall debate over the election laws passed in the states.
It's almost like we're having a little trouble with nuance these days culturally. Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about swing voters, where there was a slightly brighter picture. So these voters are people who voted for Trump in 2016, didn't vote for him again in 2020, mostly voted for Biden. These guys, they're interesting because they certainly don't think the election was stolen. Like, you ask them, no hands go up. They think that Joe Biden legitimately won the election, but they're still like kind of murky on it here. Let's listen to some swing voters.
There's definitely probably some fraud, but probably not more than normal.
So I don't feel like it was any different than any other election that happened. So I don't know if it's really considered fraud, right? Yeah.
If anything was impacted, it would have been human error because of the mass implementation of a system that hasn't really been tried before for the mail-in ballots and all that.
So the swing voters are always like really interesting groups because they're super thoughtful. I shouldn't sort of opine on how I think they're the most rational ones just because I tend to agree with them on a lot of things. But what's interesting to me is that there's always this like weird responsible position that gets staked out. And Fox News kind of did this where it was like, there's always fraud, but not enough fraud to change the outcome.
And fraud becomes definitional. I mean, there are things like the North Carolina congressional election in 2018 where the authorities investigated and found there was fraud by a Republican campaign. But Heritage has been trying for years to keep a fraud database. And if you go up and look at what they define as fraud, there are, number one, not enough cases, even if you lumped them all back from 2000 to like show truly fraudulent elections. There are a few examples of people who vote in one primary in one state and then move and vote in a second primary in a second state. Well, that's illegal. That gets lumped into the category of fraud. You know, somebody dies 3 days before election after they've cast the ballot gets counted. I don't know, that gets lumped into fraud, even although nobody broke any laws. There are instances where an individual has died, but their surviving spouse mails the ballot that they filled in before they died. Well, technically, that's fraud, and it gets lumped into that in some countings of fraud, but to be charitable about it, a one-off violation.
Yes. Interesting. Well, here's a big question that I had, or that I think about a lot, which is, so you got these people who decided they weren't going to vote for Trump. It was all too much. And although they think of themselves as Republicans, they feel like Republicans. I mean, they sound mostly like Republicans. But as they think about elections going forward, I always want to hear from them. I always want them to be like, obviously, I wouldn't vote for somebody who's going around saying that the election was stolen like Trump did, but it's not quite so clear cut. It may or may not be a deal breaker.
It would be very hard to vote for someone like that, I think.
I would have to really dig deep in what their other stances are and see what they're pointing at. It wouldn't be an immediate deal breaker, but I would absolutely have to investigate. And it could very well be a deal breaker after that.
Probably not, because there are probably hints of maybe a little bit of conspiracy thought process in them.
I mean, it definitely wouldn't be a deal breaker just because when you look at Republicans, you're going for every Republican vote. And I would probably try to sell them if I was a Republican candidate. So why not? Because there's lots of them.
And so the thing that I hear is there are some people who are like, yeah, you can't just keep telling this lie, and I'm not going to vote for candidates who put forward that lie. That makes sense to me. But there's a lot of other people that are like, I don't know. These guys, they talk about their friends and family. They're like, I don't know. Lots of people think this election was stolen, and they've got to appeal to those people too. So no big deal if they buy into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon. It almost seems that, at least in some Republican primaries, it's kind of the ante amongst Republican candidates that you can't say Joe Biden won. You don't have to say all elections are rigged, but you got to say something about how the election was messed up to be able to survive in a Republican primary. So then you get your swing voters trying to deal with that.
So let's pick this apart because we're taping on Wednesday. And so like the political news today is that Trump has unendorsed Mo Brooks in Alabama, right? Mo Brooks, who stood on stage with Trump the day of the insurrection and says, today is the day American patriots start kicking ass. And, he's right there with Trump, but he started to trail in the polls and wasn't doing so hot, wasn't raising a lot of money. He's got two kind of attractive opponents in the Republican primary. One is Katie Britt, who's married to like a football player who's basically running on like, we should build the wall. And the other one is this guy, Michael Durant, who is one of the Black Hawk Down guys. But Michael Durant put out a statement. And I think because it was getting out there that, Trump was going to unendorse Mo Brooks because Mo Brooks looks like he's going to lose. And so Michael Durant goes out with a statement that's like, yeah, we all need to be, strong about how the election was stolen in 2020. And like, this is him holding up a sign to Trump saying, please endorse me, please pick me. I'm the one who's really going to carry your banner on how the election was stolen. And I got a lot of people who back channeled to me like, don't worry about Mike Durant. He's a good guy. Good guy. He's the right one. But like you said, when people try to convince me that Trump's impact on the party is waning, and they point to things like, we'll see his endorsement of Mo Brooks, see Mo Brooks isn't winning. I'm like, yeah, but the opponents are all going all in on the election trutherism to try to get Trump to support them. So to me, that is a demonstration of his power, not a sense that it is diminishing. What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think the ante in so many competitive Republican primaries is election denial. And if you don't put that on the table, you're just not going to go anywhere is really bad. Now, of course, what will be really interesting to see is that how those candidates play out in the general elections. Because if there's anything that should bother them a little bit, it's that in the swing states that made the difference, the Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia group, it was moderate Republicans who split their ticket, who didn't buy the Donald Trump show, but did vote for Republicans down ballot. But if those candidates you're talking about in 2022 are leading the ballot with election denial, is that going to turn off those swing voters who were so crucial in 2020?
That is the central question I'm trying to answer.
Yep.
That's what I think about all the time. Before we close, I want to play one other part of the swing voter group, because something that goes to the heart of the big lie is just the concept of truth itself. What is true anymore? And listen to the way that some of these swing voters talk about trying to engage with the people in their lives who really believe the big lie.
If it's something like just me and my mom talking, I'll ask her, oh, where are your sources? This is my experience with this. Are we sure we're talking about the same thing? Who told you that? And she gets all offended, like, I know how to check whether my source is credible. Well, Parler is not a reliable source to me. I'm almost into conspiracy theories myself, thinking that nothing can be trusted anymore. It's like, can't trust anybody. So, it's very frustrating.
Oh, I engage pretty well too. It also depends on who it is and how many drinks I've had. Some of my friends, how crazy they are and how ridiculous they are. And then you just kind of think like how amazing these politicians have been at actually getting people to think that way, and how it's insane.
That last guy was talking about how he really argues with his friends and family who say the election was stolen, I guess, when they're out drinking. But I hear this from the swing voter groups all the time. This like, I don't know how to talk to my family. Like, they believe in Q. They believe in all these, crazy conspiracy theories. And then they'll kind of say, like, one of the women did there, and I don't know what's true anymore. Like, I'm trying here. And so to me, the big lie, the only reason it is available to take root is because we are losing a sense of being rooted to the truth in general, both in terms of information streams and everything. But like, how do we deal with that, Ben? Answer me that.
You talk about great existential questions of our time. That would be it. But it does point out what we were talking about before, which is the polarization that is gripping the country, and how the thing that we need to do is to foster those conversations amongst people who disagree. Because I think it is true If you get people who disagree in a room together, it's often harder to sustain the hate. And while it does break up families, what I think is really important is getting people across the political spectrum, election deniers and election supporters, in the room with election officials to talk about elections. And to do that on a community basis, it's not a national conversation. It's with real people in the real communities, not the pols, to be able to at least have a group of people who will support the basic and fundamental institution of elections.
You know, I really agree with this. Like when people are like, well, what's the solution? First of all, it does have to be hyper local because the breakdown of trust, it can't come from national sources. It has to be from people like them, from their communities that they know. And I think that one of the pernicious things that's happened in elections is that people do feel intimidated. All this stuff with poll watchers and the anger. And what you don't want is for people to kind of opt out of this civic ritual that we have around voting because they're afraid or because it gets intimidating. And so going into 2022 and certainly 2024, I would like to hear from a lot of the poll workers themselves, the people from the communities talking about how seriously they take it and how they stand side by side with other people who disagree with them. But they have been doing this together for 20 years. I mean, a lot of them are like little old ladies, you know, who live down the street who always do this because it's something that they do for their community that they love. That to me is like trying to inject some of that civic virtue back into it. This is like a process that we do every, 2 years where we tend to our democracy and that it is good and part of civic hygiene. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's got to be local. I mean, look, if you need an example of why the national approach doesn't work, for the past 15 months, the mainstream media, every organization on it has repeatedly talked about the big lie. Like any element that used to be in the news media of we're going to present both sides of the story is not there when it comes to elections. It is all about the big lie. And as you know from your polls, the number of people who still don't believe that the elections were accurate has not budged one iota in those 15 months. If anything, it's gone up. And that just tells you that the national messaging from the big media outlets is not getting through, and people do not believe the national entities. So that's why I think we got to start going local. And the communities where you got to go first is pretty self-evident.
All right, Ben Ginsberg, thanks so much for being here. We may circle back and do this one again after 2022 because I will be real interested to see whether or not, if Republicans do well in 2022, if some of the lie narrative starts to fade away. But Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks all of you for listening. And hey, listen, if you love this podcast, do me a favor, go and rate the podcast on iTunes, help other people find it, share it on Twitter. I think that there's nothing more interesting, I guess to me, that's why I do the podcast, than listening to these real voices. So anything you can do to help push it out there is appreciated. And we'll see you guys next week.